I did have ramen for lunch, but it was momofuku, which they have in New York too, so I guess not an authentic Toronto experience. So last talk of the day, amazing conference so far. How you guys doing? Oh, all right, cool. Still got some energy for the end of the day. So today I'm going to talk about collaboration. I'm going to talk about why it's so important, and I'm going to share a set of very concrete techniques that you can take back with you to your team. And hopefully, by the time you leave, if I did my job well, you'll be already strategizing and thinking to yourself, like, how can you actually get these to work in your environments? So, when I started designing for the web in 2005, phones looked like this. I had one of those. Websites looked like this. The American president looked like this. And if we're really, really lucky, and with my fingers crossed, soon it will look like this. Otherwise, I'm moving back home to Vancouver. Politics aside, over the years, I've worked on more projects than I'd like to admit, as probably a lot of other speakers today, and probably many people in the room, where a good chunk, more than half of the effort on that project, was just spent salvaging mistakes made from poor communication or working in silos or assumptions that were made throughout the way. And about 5 years before moving to New York and working at Etsy, I worked on a large-scale, very, very large-scale website for university that was the most epic process fail I have ever experienced. And I think Tom mentioned something earlier today about when you learn to do things, do them really badly, and then you really learn them. This was the really badly for me. And so this project, large university website, went a year longer than it should. It went about 6 figures over budget. And many of the beautiful, this was the larger problems as well, but many of the beautiful designs that I had done, all those little details that make you really proud of your work, those didn't even make it into the final product because the system was so complex, we were just scrambling to get the basics done. This was an epic, epic fail of process. Now, thankfully, the website itself, it turned out pretty well, and we got good feedback from the client and from users, but after that experience, I vowed I would never, ever go through that again. So since that epic fail, I've been on this ongoing quest to figure out better ways to collaborate so that me, like personally, and by extension my team, we can spend more time focusing on actually building the products and making and doing the design, doing the part that we love, instead of having to deal with all that crap that comes with poor process. Plus, I can watch this like a bazillion times. So as designers, if you're not like in a senior management role, you may not always have control over your own process. So you might work in an environment that's very waterfall. So you do your designs, you hand that over to the next team, and that team works on stuff, and then that hands over to maybe the developers and quality assurance, and it's a very, one person hands something off to the next process. Or you might be working in an agile environment where you're doing sprints every couple weeks, you have a scrum master, it's super formal, you might be working somewhere in between. So you might not have control over the larger process, but one thing as designers that we do have is the choice of how we work. What techniques do we bring into our own process? And how can we make those techniques as collaborative and inclusive as possible? So recently I did a very, very informal poll with some of my colleagues at Etsy, and I asked them if they've ever done the same process twice on a project. And it was really interesting. Almost uniformly, people said no. Like, no, every time I do a new project, the process is a little different. And that's been 100% my experience. I have never done the same process twice. And there's a very good reason for that. Our technology changes all the time. You might be working on one project that's a redesign of a system, or you might be building something from scratch. You might be working with a team that has a certain expertise, and then move to another project where you have slightly different team members and different expertise on that team. So every project is different, and because of that, you as a designer need to bring skills to the table that are adaptable and flexible. And so the techniques that I'm going to share with you today are something that you can bring back into your toolbox, and you can adapt them to all these different changes in the projects that you work on. So I'm going to share 5 techniques today that I absolutely love, that are totally indispensable to how I work. And these techniques are all meant to bring your team into the design process. And I found that once I started doing that, once I started actually involving the broad scope of my team into my project, the project became so much more fun, so much more satisfying, and like substantially, visibly more successful. So, before we dive into those specific techniques, let's talk for a second about why collaboration is so important. So, there's really, for me, two main reasons for that. The first is sort of inward, so you're collecting knowledge. So when you start off a project and you make it collaborative and you engage stakeholders, maybe you engage the client and your engineers, you're gathering really important information as you're going through the process. So with stakeholders, you're getting information about what kind of goals you have, what kind of metrics you need. You're working strategically, and you can be in alignment with those. When you're involving engineers, you get all sorts of information about the technical limitations, but maybe the technical opportunities as well. So you're educating yourself as you go by involving them in the process. And this is especially important at the beginning. And the second is an outward one, where you're sharing design thinking and UX with the rest of the team. And this is so, so important. Because let's take for a second, think about research. When you involve people in research, all of a sudden everyone has a really deep understanding of why they're building what they're building. They have a really deep understanding of the users and why decisions are being made. When you involve them in ideation, it draws on the creativity of a very diverse set of people. Hopefully your team, every team that I've worked with, each person brings their own skill, and we hired them because they're really excellent at what they do, but they're also very creative people. And when you're able to get their input and feedback, it's a much more rich piece of feedback that you're getting, but it also gives them ownership and investment in the product. And the last is that with creation, it becomes a way to reduce documentation, because everyone is on the same page. You're all working together, and the feedback loop is really tightened between you, and you can make sure that you catch wrong assumptions very early on. So I have a friend who's a developer at an interiors blog called Apartment Therapy, and he summed this up perfectly. He said, being involved from the beginning gives me a greater sense of ownership over the project. I'm not just implementing something somebody hands me, I'm helping real people solve real problems, and that not only makes me happier in my work, it also motivates me to make sure every detail is done just right. You cannot underestimate that sense of ownership that comes with being involved in the process. So the first technique I'm going to share with you is empathy mapping. And the word empathy has gone around a lot today, and this is a real practical technique that you can bring back to your team. So at the beginning of a project, it's really, really easy to get hyper-focused on the features you'll be building. So a client may come to you and say, all right, I need an e-commerce website, and it needs to have a really robust customer relation platform, and it needs to have a cat that floats into the cart every time you press the Add to Cart button, because that's what the Zappos app does, and that's for reals. You should try the Zappos app. If you have not, that's what actually happens. It's a good animation plug. It caught your attention. So when you're in feature first mode, it's really easy to forget why you're building what you're building, right? And get caught up in the details and build stuff that might not actually have real impact for your users. And as a person standing here at a UX conference, sort of at the podium, I've done this way more times than I would like to admit. It's so, so easy to fall into that trap of feature-first thinking. So one of my favorite ways to counter this and switch to a people-first mode is to make empathy maps. And when you put yourself in the user's shoes, something magical happens. All of a sudden, you can anticipate all those WTF moments, and you can really start understanding what the pain points of the flow can be. All of a sudden, all these scenarios and emotions that people might have that you may not have considered sort of come into the forefront and help inform your product. And when you include the whole team, all of a sudden, everyone has that information. Everyone has that knowledge and buy-in, knows exactly why decisions are made. And when I mention the full team going forward, this can also involve clients. The people who really are paying you to do what you do, you can give them insights into why decisions are being made. It's just something to keep in mind. So I'm going to share with you a story in a bit of empathy mapping sesh that we recently did, but one of the things that a participant in that empathy mapping sesh said was getting teammates with different backgrounds together was so valuable. We surfaced so many more insights and arrived at a more robust prototype. and more robust prototype ideas together than any of us could have done by ourselves. Each team member really realized the value of having other people there. So how does this thing work? So traditionally, empathy maps cover quite a bit of ground. So this is an image from a book called Game Storming, which is an excellent book with a lot of really great techniques. This was often a technique done by marketing departments just to get a sense of who the user is. And so you've got what a person is thinking and hearing and seeing and saying and doing and feeling. It's pretty involved. When I do empathy map sessions, I really prefer a simpler and narrower and more focused approach on what the user does, thinks, and feels. And there are a bazillion ways to run empathy maps, mapping workshops, and to do these empathy maps. But I'm going to describe a story of one I recently did, and that is also one of my favorite ways to run them. So, to give a little background, a few weeks ago, my team kicked off a new project. And this project is for a feature that is almost guaranteed to be controversial with the Etsy community. And in order to get buy-in for that, our business manager, so we have a business manager on our team that does a lot of the high-level decisions, she had to come up with a lot of the feature set in advance so she could sell that to higher-level management. She could be like, look, management, we have to do this. It's really important, even though it's controversial. That means she had done a lot of the thinking in advance, and she'd done a lot of the thinking from a feature perspective on her own. So when it came time to do the team kickoff, where everyone on the team was involved in that, I decided with the team, with the business manager, we're like, let's run an empathy mapping session. Let's take a moment and step back from the work that you've done. Let's acknowledge the work that you've done, but also make sure that the entire team starts getting themselves in the perspective of our user and really puts themselves in those shoes. Let's do an empathy mapping session so we can all get our heads around the feature itself, but make sure that the features that she came up with were actually serving our users. So a typical empathy mapping session will look like this. And don't worry about capturing everything right now very quickly, because I'm going to go through each step in detail. So to begin the session, the facilitator, which in this case was me, will do a little intro, tell you like, what is an empathy map, how does it work, and why are we doing this? So the goal really is to move from a feature-first approach to a people-first approach. Next, we spend some time reviewing the user profile. So you may do this session before you do a huge chunk of user research. You can do it afterwards. There's a lot of benefits to either perspective. In our case, we know our user really well. We have a lot of data around it. So our marketing manager actually spent some time and walked everyone through, just as a reminder, here's who this person is. Especially, and for us, this was more of a data-focused approach. So like, this is what they make, etc. So he spent about 5 minutes talking us through what we know. And next, I introduced scenarios. And scenarios are actual situations that a user might find themselves in as they're going through your product. Now, when you're doing empathy maps, you don't always have to use scenarios, but for me, they are one of the most valuable things because you're actually putting yourself in the mind of a person going through a specific task. And I found that that brings much richer insights if you can do that. So for this particular workshop, we put together 2 scenarios, and here's an example from it. Now, for me, the act of writing these scenarios was incredibly valuable. We had our head focused on one particular user with one particular scenario. And as I was writing these, I realized, oh my goodness, we completely forgot someone else. We completely forgot another scenario that this feature will cause that user a lot of pain and a lot of extra work. And that was something we just hadn't considered. So even the act of writing these scenarios and putting myself in the user's shoes sort of surfaced another group that we otherwise may have only discovered like a month down the line. So I presented these scenarios to the team. In this case, we had 2 scenarios with 1 user, and then took the larger group and divided them into 2 teams. So each team focused on mapping 1 scenario. And before they actually started doing the mapping, I showed an example. And I really, really like showing an example like this beforehand. So in this case, registering for Spotlight UX. This gives you a really concrete sense of what will go in the do, think, and feel categories. So I gave an example specific to Etsy, sort of got them to understand, all right, this is how you'd fill this thing out. And then they're each in their groups. They know their scenarios. They know what they need to do. The team then got 10 minutes to write down on sticky notes do's, thinks, and feels. So each person would write down on their own for 10 minutes, just quietly working away, putting themselves in the user's shoes from that scenario's perspective, what they imagine the user would do, think, and feel. And this was really important, to have that individual time to reflect, for 2 reasons. One, it reduces groupthink, so each person can bring their own personal perspective forward. And the second, it really accounts for people who might have a quieter voice, who might not always speak up in the room, and by having everyone do the exercise and then share it back, you make sure those people have a voice. So after everyone wrote and put together their own sticky notes, they shared them back with their smaller group and summarized the notes. So we put them on a whiteboard, and as everybody put them on a whiteboard in the 3 different columns, we started looking at the different themes that were emerging. It's like, oh my goodness, the think and feel in these cases are extremely negative. Oh my gosh, we didn't realize that this would cause so much pain. And that was a really, really excellent insight for us going in, because we just caught something that we, like I said, might have caught something down the line, and it gave us such a huge opportunity to address that immediately. And remember, this was a kickoff meeting. At a kickoff meeting, we're all of a sudden realizing what pain points we were going to have to address as we're moving forward. So what I love about this exercise is that everyone always has a slightly different take on the do, thinks, and feel steps, so that by the time you're done, you get a really holistic picture. And in this workshop that we did, each person, as we were going through it, had at least one moment where they gave a point and the rest of the team went, oh yeah, dude, I totally didn't think about that. So by the time we were done, everyone, including the business manager who initially put this together, we realized that we had those pain points and we needed to increase the scope of the project. And because we had everyone there, the business manager, the engineers, the developers, the marketing person, everyone immediately had buy-in to extending the scope, and everyone knew exactly what our pain points would be. We established so much in just that first kickoff meeting from Empathy Maps. All right, on to the next one. We'll talk about research for a bit. But before we dive into research, I want to give you a little background about how we work at Etsy, and especially me and my team. So at Etsy, I work on the manufacturing team, which is a team that builds tools for sellers who want to scale their business and work with values-aligned partners. So basically responsible manufacturers. And my team looks a little bit like this. We've got a product manager, a business manager, a designer. We've got 4 developers and a marketing manager. These are the people I sit with. These are the people I work with day to day. At Etsy, we also have a research team, and that research team is separate, and they serve as consultants to the product teams. So when the research team goes into the field to do their research, they always have a slot for a designer from the product team and somebody else from that team to come participate and get to witness that user research when they do on-site stuff. So recently, we had a new marketing manager join our team, and one of the first things he did is he went out and did these research sessions. And one thing that he heard over and over from our manufacturers is, we want to work with designers who know what they want. And this phrase came up. I think he went to a couple sessions, but people repeated it over and over again. So when we were working on the marketing pages and collaborating on that, that was something that made its way into the copy. So you can see here, get leads from designers who know what they want. He had that reference. He heard it straight from manufacturers and was able to integrate it into the copy. So just the power of bringing people on site. The problem with this, though, is you might want to include your whole team in research, but that's awkward because you don't want to have like many, many people observing one person or 2 people. So not everybody's able to participate. And so in the past at Etsy, the way things would go is that the researchers would spend a lot of time digesting. They'd do all the sessions, they'd digest, they'd aggregate all the results, they'd put them together in a PowerPoint-ish style presentation, and they'd present it back to the team. But the problem was that those research insights just weren't sticking. And so they decided to change their approach. So to address these, they now run research debrief workshops, which I'll run you through exactly how they work. And I've participated in a bunch of these, and they're so fabulous. So I'm not necessarily able to attend all the in-person research sessions, but what this does is it gives me so much more color and so much more insights into how people actually responded versus just watching a PowerPoint presentation that somebody did. Being actively part of the insights process, aggregating all those insights, really is a powerful thing. So these magical things work a little bit like this. Again, the intro, the facilitator introduces how it works. So the research team in general will do anywhere from 6 to 8 sessions of in-person research at a time. And at each session, at least 1 or 2 people take pretty detailed notes. So for the workshop begins with spending 20 minutes with each participant taking a set of notes and reading them. And these would be notes from a session that they didn't attend, ideally. So they spend 20 minutes reading through these transcripts, and they're highlighting everything that is really interesting that they come across. And I like using the same mindset as the empathy map. So what are people doing, thinking, and feeling? So highlighting all those things that come up. And it's really important to give it time. So like those 20 minutes are really time for you to sink in and read in depth. The next thing, after those 20 minutes, is to go back to all the things you've highlighted and start writing how might we statements. And how might we statements, and we write these on Post-it notes, are statements that look at problems and present them as an opportunity. So if we see in our transcript, for example, over here, that a manufacturer said, back and forth with the person takes a lot of time. Sometimes it's waiting for them to pay. Paying takes a lot of time. Our how might we statement, say something like, how might we facilitate faster payments? So framing everything in terms of opportunities. So we take about 10 minutes, go through all of our notes, and frame and put together all these how might we statements. And then once all those 10 minutes are up, each team member stands up, go around in a circle. They give a very short overview of the background of the person, of the transcript that they read, and then they share the how might we's back to the team, and again, post them on the board. We really like post-it exercises at Etsy. So as each person goes around and talks about their user and puts their how might we's on the wall, the facilitator actually starts aggregating, and again, thematically putting the post-its in groups. And once the statements are all on the wall, we've designated one person at the beginning of the meeting to be the decision maker, who then says, okay, we've seen all these themes come up. We're going to address X, Y, and Z. I really have gone into my American mode with Z and said, we're going to address these top things, and we're going to put all the rest on the back burner. We know they're important, but we're going to come back and visit them. So, all right. Let's take a step back and think about the researcher for a second. So we have one researcher I know for sure in the audience. Any people who just identify as UX researchers? Awesome. So when you're doing all these on-site interviews, the whole process of documentation can be a beast. So each session you have to read over your notes, you have to aggregate all those results, to synthesize them, then you have to put a presentation together and you have to present it back to your team and hope that it sticks. So one of the beauties of running one of these empathy map workshops is that the researcher gets to outsource all of that synthesis back to the team. So all they have to do is prepare a session, a 1-hour session, and then the team itself does all the synthesizing, does all that aggregating of data. And it's a really powerful thing because the researcher just saved themselves a lot of time in documentation and trying to communicate something. And on the other side, the team has now gained such a deeper understanding of the user and all the research needs. So to me, that's a win. So one of my favorite ways, that's technique number 3, to get the full team invested in a project is to run sketch studios, which is really a fancy way of saying get people in a room and draw together. And I like doing that in a slightly more structured environment. And it really helps build a shared understanding of everyone's point of view and expectations and speeds up the process of getting to the final design by a lot, I found. So I'm going to give you an example from a client that I worked with back in consulting. So the first 2 examples were from Etsy, where it's a product environment, but you might be from a consulting environment. So I'm just going to share a few stories from different companies that I've worked at. So this is a story from a project that I worked for a transit company, and we were redesigning their intranet. And the intranet for this company was a very important piece of communication for them. It was the lifeblood. So if you were a bus driver and you needed to request time off for a shift in your route, that's where you did that. It was also where all their email happened. It was a very, very important tool for them. Using these sketch studios was one of the absolute keys to the success of the project. So typically in the UX world, these sketching sessions are done by the UX team and the design group. We like to get ourselves together and do these sketch sessions and make our little pretty wireframes on the board. But the most successful ones I've ever done, and as the theme of this talk you'll see, it's really including a broader group in the process. And in this case, there were 3 of us. With these sketch sessions, I definitely recommend keeping a slightly smaller group to keep it focused. We had a UX designer, a UI designer, and a developer or engineer. So in this case, I was serving as the UI designer. We had a UX person on staff. The engineer, he was also the client. So the transit company had an engineer on staff, and they were going to give him over to work with us. So he served as both the client and the developer at the same time, which was really, really valuable. And because of that, as we were doing our sketching together, because he was building this, he had every incentive to make sure that everything we were sketching was stuff that he could build. So the intranet itself had 10 distinct features. And to keep focused on each feature, we actually held 10 separate sketch sessions, 1 per feature. And we did that over the course of a few weeks. And in order to lower the stakes of the first one, we actually focused on the lowest priority features. So they had a classified system, which is fine. It was kind of useful. It reduced the email sort of noise, but it wasn't the most important thing. So we started with the classified section just so we could get our process down and we could really understand how this thing worked and make sure that we sort of worked out the kinks. And the next thing is it's really important to come prepared and have focus to each session. In the beginning of each session, we reviewed a very, very informal, pretty ugly Google Doc that we had put together that just had the overview of what feature we were going to draw. And so this was the classified page. What do we need to think about? What are competitors doing? What kind of things can help frame the session that we run that day? And it's really important, again, when you're doing these, you want to make sure you're taking full advantage of everyone's time. And coming prepared with something makes a huge difference. So this is the really fun part. And the slides I'm showing here are from a sketch session that we ran with for the dashboard. So this was where I would draw things on the board, and then the developer would come in and he'd sketch some stuff next to me and we'd erase. And as we went along, we'd make sure to photograph every decision. So it's really important to just make sure when you're working on a whiteboard to constantly be documenting the work that you're doing. But it was really great because we were able to have discussions in real time. And it was so cool, like I said earlier, to have the developer who was going to be working on this, because also as the client, he immediately knew what was going to work and was able to fill in knowledge gaps as they came up. We also held these sessions at the client's office. So if any questions came up, the developer could just pick up the phone and be like, hey, person who knows the answer to this, do you mind running down? We have some stuff on a whiteboard. We'd love to get your feedback. So it closed that communication loop. We were able to get answers so quickly. So after each session, we'd go back to our office with all the photographs that we'd taken for that day, and then we put them into an annotated wireframe that served as the documentation, and then later, of course, we'd build this out into a prototype, test it, etc. But this was sort of how do you get to that point where you know that this is something that you can build, that you can actually move forward with, that everybody's on board with, and then you can test and validate. So in total, we had about 10 sketch sessions, average of 2 hours each. So in 20 hours, we got so much more consensus and progress than we historically got in double that time. I remember the first time I ran a session like this, we actually came in 40 hours under budget. It was that big of an impact. So I definitely encourage you to experiment and adapt this to your team. Like I said, I find that when you're working on specific flows like this, it's really better to have a smaller group. If you're working on things that are more high level and a little bit more ideation of what the feature is even going to be, that's when you can bring in a larger group and maybe change up your technique a little bit. But you'll be able to solve problems so much more effectively, bring your team together, and there's just so much fun to do. I always enjoy them, and everybody always just gets so much about doing that exercise. So the next technique is one, if you went to design school, or art school, you're super familiar with this. And I actually mentioned it here because it's also one that's really easy to forget to do. This is more of a reminder. This is something you all know how to do, but this is just like, hey, we should be doing these more often. They're also, if you went to design school, something that you're taught to do with other designers. Those are the people in the room who you critiqued with, who you got design feedback from. That's how we did it. But when we're working on products that have the level of complexity that our day-to-day products have, it's so important to get regular feedback from every member of the team. So product managers, marketing people, you might have copywriters, content strategists, developers on your team. Whatever your team makeup is, they're the people working on the project with you, and it's really helpful for them to know where you're at in the process so they can give you feedback. They can flag any issues that they see in advance, and they might even like end up championing your design because maybe they have a meeting with somebody else and they can be like, oh, I saw that, how the designer addressed that. I think we're really on the right track, etc. So they're both an advocate for you, and they can really give you that valuable feedback that you need. Because the worst thing that you want to hear from especially a developer after getting client sign-off on something is, wow, this looks really great. You obviously spent a lot of time on this, but sorry, you can't build it. So I hear laughter. People have experienced this before. So I've spoken with a lot of developers over the years. A friend of mine, has said when developers are involved in the process, they can warn you about parts that are harder to implement. Developers want to be involved from the beginning. Really, every team member that I've worked with wants to be involved from the beginning. They want to have that ownership, and they want to understand what you're working on, and give you feedback to make sure that you're all working in the right direction and all moving in the right way. The second thing, so we talked about team-wide critiques, is informal critiques. So regular informal touch bases with the people that you work with. So as I mentioned earlier, at Etsy, we work on product teams. So I don't actually sit, so we have 30 product designers at Etsy, and I do not sit with them. I sit with my manufacturing team. And that is actually a super amazing experience, because if I'm working on something, and I'm just like jamming away on my UI, and I have a question about, okay, so if I'm going to do this, is that something that's easy to build, or is that something with our technical infrastructure that's a pain in the ass? So I can just turn to my right, and Jacob, the engineer, sits right there, and I'm like, hey, Jacob, can you just take a look at this thing? Because I'm not sure if it'll work. And he looks over and he goes, yeah, totally cool. Or he'll be like, ooh, you know what? If you just like change this and this and this, that'll probably save us like quite a few hours. So I'm able to get that constant stream of feedback just by turning to somebody and saying like, hey, can you take a look? So proactively asking for feedback, so not a natural inclination for a lot of us. It's kind of, especially showing our designs early, it's a little bit uncomfortable. But making group priorities a critique, having people ask those hard questions, and really challenging ourselves to answer them is incredibly valuable. And it really can help us innovate a lot more and give us more ideas that we might not even considered in advance. So next time you do a critique, grab somebody that you might not have considered critiquing with before, and let your team really help you innovate and push what you're doing forward. Now, this last technique is one I debated about including in this, because I know this is a UX conference, and it's not about coding. But this thing has been so dramatically important to my own process and to my own sort of getting empathy for the people, for the engineers and developers that I work with, that I wanted to share with you in case you ever decide to move forward and try this out. So, for the designers in the room for a second, how many of you have designed something totally beautiful, you absolutely love, you hand it over to a developer, and then you get something back and it's just like, oof, it's not quite there. Okay, we have somebody in the room. Or if there are any developers in the room, how many of you have done something that you're really proud of, and then you show it to the designer, and they're like, oh my God, here's my laundry list of like 100 things that you need to fix. Yeah, putting ourselves in the shoes of the developer for a second. It's really demoralizing. So the thing that I have learned that I find extremely important is that we can learn to tweak the code ourselves. So at Etsy, designers are expected to work in code. So we do a lot of the front-end development of our own user interfaces. And as a matter of fact, every single employee at the company is encouraged to do something that we call the first push program, which is every person at the company is encouraged to push code to the production site, to our live site, in the first week that they're at the company. And this is kind of unusual, but it's also so important to the company's ethos because the company wants to create a sense of empathy and understanding to how our developers work. We're definitely like engineering first culture, and having the entire company, even the accountants and the legal team, try their hand at pushing code shows them how our process works. It's really, really cool. And there's been a lot of effort to make that program happen. So I recently worked a couple years ago on a project for the New York Times. I was redesigning their mobile order form. And at the Times, it's not standard practice for designers to code. So I'm sharing you an example of somewhere that, this wasn't how it always worked. But I was working with another designer, and we really wanted to try experimenting with this. We were like, all right, let's see if we can actually tweak our own code. We're not going to write our whole thing from scratch. I'm not a developer. I don't know how to do JavaScript, etc. But I just want to be able to make all my type A obsessive designer tweaks on my own. So we pitched this idea to the developer on the project, and he was like, hells yes! Please, I hate making CSS tweaks. I am going to show you how to do this so that you can make your own. And it was like, all right, cool, let's do this. So typically, when I look at a website that maybe a developer has built and I want to make some tweaks, I'll go into the browser and I'll right-click on an element and inspect it. And that's pretty much what you're seeing here. You can actually see the code and make tweaks in real time. And this is a really great way to learn HTML and CSS because all you're doing is you're changing numbers and values and words, and you're seeing how that actually appears on your website on the right here. So I had been doing this for quite a few years, so I understood how to tweak things, and I knew how to do that. But the problem with inspecting in browser and making changes is that you can't save them. This is a really big problem, right? Otherwise, I'm going to have to copy bits of code and send them to the developer and hope that I did it right. So if you're a total beginner, the first step is to just play around with this and learn a little bit of CSS and HTML. And there's lots of courses online to do that. And the first thing you need is the right tools. So you need a place to write code. And there's a lot of free tools out there that are actually pretty great. I use one called Sublime Text. Adobe has a tool called Brackets that's open source that a lot of people like, especially as beginners. So you need a place to actually write the code. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and this is the one that is scary as hell, is version control. This is the thing that I was always very, very hesitant about learning in order to start coding. So version control is a way for you to have a safety net. So if you break any of the code, you can revert back to an older version so that you didn't really mess anything up. And one of the more common versions of version control that engineers use is Git. So you may have heard of Git. So Git, Git's scary. Git is like a UI without a UI. It's like you have to put in a bunch of commands and hope they work. And there's a lot of classes online that you can use, but it's also really helpful for us when we were working at the New York Times. Our engineer, he spent a lot of time with us just giving us the cheat sheet of this is what you need to know. Here's a set of commands that if you can learn this, you're all good. And we'll take care of you and make sure that you feel like you know what you're doing and you feel safe. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge. It's not the HTML and CSS. You guys got that. You'll figure that out really quick. It's being able to work with an engineer to get you through understanding how to use version control a little bit, just enough to be dangerous. So yes, as I was saying, our engineer gave us a crash course, and it was amazing just to be able to do our own changes. So even if this is above your level of expertise now, it's something to shoot for. And I'm not speaking to you as a super expert here. It's something that I'm still experimenting and still learning, but it's just so much more satisfying. Like I said, I'm able to tweak things on the screen as I see them. I'm able to spend as much time as I want making my changes. And then I also understand how developers work more, and I'm able to understand the development process and have a much more rich insight into that as well. So, I know I said we only had 5 techniques, but I'm throwing in a bonus one. This is more of a process. And at the beginning of this talk, I said that designers don't always have control over how they work. And that's still true. But if you don't do this already, this is the one thing that I would so very much encourage you to advocate for in your organization, to shift to a way of working that's in parallel. Because working in parallel is like the secret sauce to everything I just told you about. And what do I mean by that? Just to give you some background. So traditionally, software was built in the waterfall method. So each team does its thing, very much like an antiquated relay race. You do the research is done, hands it over to UX. UX is the thing, hands it over to design. At that point, maybe the UXers and the researchers are totally off doing something else. This is a big problem because it absolutely kills communication. And what happens when you're working in silos like that is that it's really easy to develop tunnel vision. And this causes a lack of ownership. So let's say you're only working on your own part. It's so easy to be like, oh my God, I can't believe the developer didn't build this right. What were they thinking? And from the developer side, they can be like, oh my God, those specs that the designer gave me were just like, oh, so complicated. So it's really easy to like break that communication and start not working as a team. So an alternative to this is to work in parallel. And this is where the team is working in tandem throughout the process. So you're not just handing stuff over, you're actually working on stuff at the same time. And this is super important because it encourages communication as you're going along. If something happens and you need to talk about it, you have all these opportunities throughout the flow. And again, that also brings that sense of ownership when you're talking to people and safety and trust in the team. Another problem is that it doesn't leave room for iteration. So let's hypothetically say you have 5 months to launch a website. Each column here represents a month. If you discover any issues or opportunities, maybe around the end of month 3, beginning of month 4, you don't have really much time to address that, right? You're like, uh-oh, we're right at the end of the project. Can we tack on another week or month, or in my case, for the awful fail, a year? And you're left at no, like you can't address them immediately. So the solution is to work, again, in parallel. Here, like before, we have 5 months, but if we discover something at a later phase, all hands are on deck to address it. It's not like we have to be like, hey, designer who stopped working on the project a couple weeks ago, can you come back in and give me context for what you were trying to do? You just immediately all can address the problem and work on it. You're not moving backwards to a previous phase. And the last thing is that working in the waterfall method means that you have to do a really big handoff. So the epic fail project I told you about, we had a Google Doc that was like 100, 110 pages of documentation that we handed over to the developers. And can you just imagine the stress of being on the receiving end of that, where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm a developer who has to read 100 pages of documentation and get everything perfect. So when you're working in parallel and you're doing all those workshops and critiques and you're working in code, that increases the mind share throughout the course of the project and reduces the weight so dramatically on that big document that you then have to, you don't have to count on everything being in that written doc. Because like seriously, who in this world wants to read through 100 pages of documentation? So the goal of every technique I've shared with you today is just to increase transparency and communication. And if this isn't something you're able to do, even the workshops, all the techniques I showed you earlier, those are about 1,000,000 times better than not doing anything. But if you can somehow work in parallel, it really brings all those things together. You get such a tighter communication with the team. You can address project needs earlier, and documentation doesn't become such a beast anymore. So to wrap things up, my friend and colleague Kwan recently wrote an article and said, a delightful end experience is the fruit of thoughtful UX, elegant UI, smooth front end, reliable back end, and many caregivers throughout the making process. And it was the word caregivers that really hit home for me. Because it's people who care, right, about the product, about the team, about the user, about each other. In short, this is it's a product made by the whole team. And one of the most important side effects of all the techniques I shared with you today in collaborating is that it builds a sense of trust on the team, right? It fosters a sense of knowing that if you put forward an idea, it might not be shut down. You really build that camaraderie. Because at the end of the day, it's not technology making products, it's the people who are making products. And when you're making products, people need to understand why they're making them and who they're making them for. Because I have no doubt whatsoever that the future of our industry is collaboration. And it's the only way, at least at this point in time, to deal with all the complexity that we have to deal with on a regular basis. So I have a couple parting words for you. Stop, collaborate, and listen. And whatever tool or method you use, let it be one that empowers your team and allows them to be true partners. Because there's so much magic that happens when the walls between silos are broken down. Thanks. How are we doing?
The 2 questions.
Cool. Yeah. Hey. Thanks. Mm-hmm. And how often? Sure. So the question was, how do we do documentation at Etsy, and how often do we revisit it? So documentation, there's a few different things that we document. First is project goals, requirements, etc. Those are in Google Docs. We revisit those every so often. I am personally a really big fan of a tool called Zeppelin, where it interacts with Sketch, so you can immediately export your sketch files into Zeppelin, and Zeppelin is a tool to annotate your designs. And so it's a way for you to have, you can make real-time updates, and then everybody who's, especially building your site gets to see the annotations as well. So that's, I would say, one particular form that I absolutely love, and especially when you're in the building cycle, that's something the engineers are referencing all the time. Otherwise, we meet every day. We have a daily stand-up. We also have regular critique meetings and regular feedback meetings. So the need for documentation just goes down so much that way, because you're constantly talking about the things that you're building. Cool. Great. Thanks. Yeah.
Group work can be or teamwork can be challenging.
Totally.
Right? So how do you deal with conflict or with stronger personalities, or they're trying to get stuff done one way, but it's not the greatest. You have better vision.
All right, so the question was, how do you deal with conflict when you're collaborating? That's a hard one. So I think one of the things that's really helpful when we're doing these exercises is that there's usually a designated decision maker in the room. So we have a business manager on our team. That business manager decides on the strategy. That person generally gets to have the final say on strategy. As a product designer, I get the final say on UI and what the flows are, and the developers get the final say on what the technology they're using and what kind of scope can we handle. So we sort of know our roles and what the expectations are, and that makes a really big difference. We also spend a lot of time getting to know each other as a team. So building that trust through exercises every Monday we just all talk about our weekend and what we did over the weekend. So we see ourselves do monthly outings and drinks and stuff, just so important to build that trust and community in the team, so that when you come to actually the conflicts in the sessions, it's a little bit easier because you've built that trust. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but hopefully. It's a tough one. Are we at time? Hey, yeah?
Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed all those
Thanks.
tips and techniques. Have you got any advice for distributed teams?
Ooh, I had a feeling that would come up. Those are really good questions. The question was, do I have any advice for distributed teams? So we on our team have 2 remote developers, and it's always a challenge. So that's uniformly, it's something we're constantly trying to figure out how to do better. We use a tool called Video with a VIDYO. It's it's just our video sharing tool, but it's not ideal. We also have a chat channel that we go back and forth. When I'm running these techniques, so the empathy map session that we ran a few weeks ago, the way we did it was we had the people in real life, and then we had somebody on the laptop, and as he was sharing his Post-it notes, somebody else would write it down and post it to the wall. So that's like an example of somebody who's just like, there's one person remote. For distributed teams, I know that IBM uses a tool called Mural that they absolutely love. I have a friend who works at IBM, and she swears by it, but I've never tried it. So it's expensive. Okay, yeah, of course. But yeah, so I haven't had experience with fully distributed teams, just working with particular remote people. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much. Okay.